Growing up, it was just me and Mom. Dad bailed when I was just a tyke, a faded memory more than anything else. Mom worked her fingers to the bone, juggling jobs left and right to keep us afloat and to make sure I could hit the books hard. Because of her sacrifices, I snagged a grant that got me through college without the mountain of debt that was common these days. I studied business management, driven by a cocktail of ambition and fear of ever being as broke as we were when I was a kid. After graduating, I packed up my life and moved to the city. It was a tough start, living in a cramped apartment and surviving on ramen more nights than I'd like to admit. But I landed a job at a large company, started as a junior, and clawed my way up. Fast forward a few years, and I was not just working there, I was running a whole department. It was more than a job, it was my turf, and I made sure everyone who worked with me knew they were valued. You gotta lead with respect, I'd say during the trainings for the newbies. Treat this job like you own it, and soon enough, you won't just be part of the team, you'll be leading it. The team was solid, a bunch of good folks. When I got the nod for the department head spot, we hit the local bar to celebrate. It was nothing fancy, just a cozy place where the beer was cold and the laughs were plenty. Here's to Erica, the boss lady. Marco, one of my oldest colleagues, raised his glass high. The others joined in, the clinks of glasses echoing over the buzz of the bar. Thanks, guys. We're all in this together. Here's to kicking more ass and taking names. I shouted over the noise, and the team roared back in approval. That night, amid the backslaps and cheers, I noticed him, Jake. He caught me looking and sauntered over with a grin that could knock you off balance. Couldn't help but notice the celebration. What's the occasion? He asked, leaning against the bar. Just a little career boost. I'm the new head of my department now, I said, trying not to sound too braggy. That's impressive. Must be a tough gig, he replied, nodding appreciatively. I'm Jake, by the way. Erica. Nice to meet you, Jake. We got to talking more seriously than I intended that night. Turns out, Jake was a financier, knew his way around numbers like I did around project plans. Over the next 6 months, what started as casual dates turned into weekends spent together, and not long after, I was spending more time at his place than my own. He had a killer apartment, high ceilings, a view that made you want to brag about it, and a warmth that my dingy rental couldn't match. One evening, as we were overlooking the city lights from his balcony, Jake turned to me, a serious look washing over his usually playful face. He took my hands in his, and I could feel the nervous energy vibrating through them. Erica, these past months with you have been the best of my life. I know this might seem fast, but when you know, you just know, right? He started, his voice a mix of certainty and hope. I nodded, the cityscape blurring a bit as my heart started to race. He pulled out a small box from his jacket and opened it to reveal a ring that caught the light just right, sparkling almost as much as his eyes. Will you marry me, Erica? Yes, Jake. Absolutely, yes. I managed, my voice thick with emotion. And just like that, I was engaged. Engaged to a man who saw me, really saw me, and loved all the parts of me, even the ones that were tough as nails. The day I was supposed to meet Jake's parents, my stomach was in knots. As Jake drove us up to a sprawling mansion with a driveway longer than my entire apartment block, it hit me, these folks were not just well off, they were loaded. Stepping out of the car, I could feel the weight of the place. The house looked like something out of an old British movie, all brick and ivy, with gargoyles staring down like they knew I didn't belong. Jake squeezed my hand as we walked up to the huge oak doors. You'll be fine, Erica, he whispered, but his voice sounded like he was trying to convince himself too. The doors swung open, and there stood Mr. and Mrs. Hargrove. His suit probably cost more than my rent, and her dress was something you'd see in a magazine. The foyer was massive, with a chandelier overhead that sparkled like a constellation. The walls were lined with portraits of stern-looking folks with titles like Sir and Lady. Erica, lovely to finally meet you. I'm Charles, and this is my wife, Eleanor, Mr. Hargrove said, his voice smooth but cool, with a hint of an English accent that sounded practiced. Mrs. Hargrove gave me a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Pleased to meet you both, I managed, trying to keep my voice steady. As we moved into the dining room, Jake whispered quick tips about which fork to use for what, but his words were a jumble in my head. Dinner was served, and it felt like sitting in a freezer, the air so cold with judgment. Mr. Hargrove pointed to a portrait of a stern-looking man with a thick beard. That's Sir Reginald Hargrove, a direct ancestor from England. Came over in the 1800s to establish our family here, he said proudly. Really impressive, I said, trying to sound enthusiastic, but it was hard to eat when you felt like every move was being critiqued. I reached for what I thought was the salad fork, but the silence that followed told me I'd messed up. I glanced at Jake for help, but before he could whisper anything, Mrs. Hargrove's voice cut through. Perhaps things are done differently where you come from, dear, she said, each word sharp and precise. Sorry, still getting the hang of all this, I mumbled, my cheeks burning hot. Jake tried to smooth things over, jumping into a story about us, but his parents were more interested in watching my struggle with the dessert spoon next. I felt smaller with each course, their stares heavy on my shoulders. After the icy dinner, we all shuffled into the Hargroves' expansive living room. The plush carpets and heavy curtains made the room feel even more suffocating than the dining hall. I sunk into one of the ornate chairs, feeling like I was an exhibit in a museum about commoners. Mrs. Hargrove, perched elegantly on the edge of her seat, leaned forward. Erica, dear, tell us more about your family. Your upbringing must have been quite different from ours. I hesitated, feeling Jake's tense gaze on me. Well, it was mostly just me and my mom. My dad left when I was really young, and I don't remember him much. Mom did everything to raise me on her own. She's a nurse. The room fell deathly silent. Mrs. Hargrove stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the wood floor, like a scream. This is unacceptable, she declared, her voice resonating with disgust. We are descendants of an ancient English lineage. We have standards, traditions. I cannot, will not, allow my only son to marry someone without pedigree or knowledge of her own lineage. Mr. Hargrove, who had been silently observing the conversation, finally spoke. His words were calculated, each one dropping like a weight. It's essential for us that our family ties are strong and well documented. Erica, can you even name your great-grandparents? I felt my face heat up, the embarrassment gnawing at me. I only know about my maternal grandparents, I confessed, my voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Hargrove rolled his eyes, a clear sign of contempt. This is exactly what we feared, he muttered under his breath. Jake finally intervened, his tone firm yet pleading. Mom, Dad, please. Erica is kind, hardworking, and she loves me. Isn't that what should matter? His mother's gaze was steely. Respect and adherence to our family standards are what matter, Jacob. If Erica is to join this family, she must learn our ways. She needs to respect where she is coming from, even if it is nowhere significant. Their words stung, slicing through the warm feelings from earlier in the evening. But Jake was looking at me, his eyes begging me to just go along with it. I nodded, reluctantly agreeing to their terms. Fine, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I'll learn about your family and your traditions. Mrs. Hargrove seemed somewhat placated by my concession. Good. You'll start by familiarizing yourself with our family tree and understanding who each person in those portraits is. It's not just about names, Erica. It's about respect for our lineage. As they continued talking about their expectations, I felt a part of me shrivel up. The evening had turned from a simple meet and greet into a trial by fire. I had agreed to their demands, yes, but at what cost? As the room filled with discussions of ancestors and noble deeds, I couldn't help but feel alienated from these people and, oddly enough, from the parts of Jake that were tied so tightly to them. The weeks following that stiff dinner were a whirlwind. I barely had time to catch my breath between working my day job and attending the slew of etiquette and style courses that Mr. and Mrs. Hargrove insisted I take. My day started with the buzz of an alarm before sunrise and ended long after the sun had set, leaving me feeling like a zombie. Elbows off the table, Erica, the etiquette instructor chided gently during one of our sessions. And remember, the soup spoon moves away from you when you scoop. I nodded, attempting to mirror her movements, but my mind was on a million other things, like the mountain of work waiting for me back at the office and the never-ending wedding plans. "You're doing well," she reassured, her voice soothing. "These things take time to become second nature." I gave her a weak smile. "Thanks, it's a lot, you know?" As if on cue, my phone rang. It was Mom. I excused myself and stepped outside to take the call, pressing the phone against my ear while trying to find a quiet corner in the bustling city. "Hi, Mom," I greeted, my voice more tired than I intended. "Erica, darling, how are the wedding preparations going?" she asked, her voice filled with excitement and a hint of concern. I hesitated, not wanting to worry her. "It's all good. Learning a lot, even picked up how to waltz," I said, trying to keep my tone light. There was a pause, and I knew she wasn't entirely convinced. "You sound exhausted, honey. Are you getting enough rest? You know, all this shouldn't be so hard. You need to take care of yourself." I chuckled weakly. "I'll try, Mom. But there's a lot to juggle right now. Etiquette classes, dance lessons, work, and the wedding planning. Just remember what's important, Erica. It's you and Jake at the end of the day, not all these rules and lessons." Her words were a balm, but as soon as we hung up, the weight of reality settled back on my shoulders. I was caught in a tug-of-war between pleasing Jake's parents and maintaining my sanity. Every day felt like a marathon with no finish line in sight. Back inside, I resumed my training, the instructor's voice a droning background noise as I practiced the proper way to hold a wine glass, pinch the stem, not the bowl, apparently. In the rare moments of downtime, I'd find myself staring at the ceiling, wondering if all this was worth it. The constant scrutiny, the endless classes, the cold looks from Mr. and Mrs. Hargrove whenever I slipped up, which was more often than I liked to admit. One evening, as I was about to drift off to sleep, my phone buzzed. It was Jake, his text lighting up the screen. "How was your day? Miss you." I stared at the message, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. I wanted to tell him everything, to pour out my frustrations and fears, but I held back. Instead, I typed a simple, "Miss you too. Long day, but all good." As I set the phone down, the silence of my apartment felt overwhelming. Was this how it was going to be? Pushing through the exhaustion, smiling through the stress, all for the sake of fitting into a world that seemed increasingly alien to me? The big day had finally arrived. The venue was a flurry of flowers, fancy dresses, and the faces of the city's high society milling about. My stomach was in knots. As I stood in my long, flowing white dress, trying to catch a breath, my mom came over, adjusting a stray curl on my forehead. "Everything will be just fine, Erica," she reassured me with a soft smile. I wanted to believe her, but the minute the ceremony began, any hope of a peaceful wedding evaporated. Jake's parents were on a warpath of superiority. Mr. Hargrove greeted guests with an air of boastfulness, and Mrs. Hargrove was quick to point out to anyone within earshot how they had made everything possible. As the guests settled, I tried to mingle, but Mrs. Hargrove pulled me aside with a frosty smile. "Erica, dear, make sure our friends are taken care of. Fetch some drinks, there's a good girl," she instructed, gesturing imperiously towards a group of elderly gentlemen discussing politics loudly. "But," I started, only to be cut off by her sharp glance. "No buts. You're practically family now, show some initiative," she snapped. Reluctantly, I carried trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvres between tables, my dress trailing behind me. The weight of the fabric and the task made me feel more like a servant than a bride. I caught glimpses of Jake laughing and chatting, oblivious to my plight. As I passed another round of drinks, I overheard Mrs. Hargrove's voice rise above the chatter. "Erica will be serving us tonight. It's good practice for her, don't you think?" Her tone was condescending, her eyes scanning the crowd for approval. That was the last straw. I approached her, my hands shaking slightly but my voice firm. I am not a waitress at my own wedding. There are staff here who are supposed to do this. Mrs. Hargrove stood up, her expression one of mock surprise. You should be grateful we allowed such a simple girl into our family. Remember your place, Erica, she hissed, her words like daggers. I felt a flush of anger rise to my cheeks. This is my wedding, not a performance for your friends, I retorted, my voice louder than intended. The room fell silent. All eyes were on us now. Jake, catching the tail end of our exchange, stumbled over, a glass of champagne in hand. What's going on here? He slurred slightly, his eyes not fully focusing. Your mother is treating me like a servant at our wedding, Jake. This isn't what today is supposed to be about, I said, frustration boiling over. Jake looked between me and his mother, his expression clouding. Erica, why are you making a scene? Just do what my mom asks. It's not a big deal. Not a big deal? Jake, this is our day, and your mom is ruining it, I shot back, disbelief and hurt swirling together. He took a long sip of his champagne before speaking. Look, Erica, you should be happy I even chose you. There were plenty of girls better than you, prettier, richer. You're making a fuss over nothing. The word stung like a physical slap. I recoiled, the realization hitting me hard. The man I loved, the man I was about to marry, didn't see us as partners. To him, I was just another accessory, something to be molded and fit into the perfect image his parents wanted. As I clutched my bouquet tighter, feeling like I might crumble right there, my mom came over. She took one look at me and wrapped me in her arms, the kind of hug that seemed to hold the world at bay. Honey, do you love this man? Do you really want to marry him? She whispered, her voice filled with worry. I shook my head, barely able to muster the voice to speak. No, Mom, I can't do this. I don't want to. Mom nodded, her jaw setting in that determined way that I knew all too well. She gently took the bouquet from my hands and guided me to a chair, her touch reassuring. Then, with a surprising sprightliness, she approached the DJ, asked for the microphone, and turned to face the gathered crowd. Ladies and gentlemen, may I have your attention, please? Her voice, clear and steady, cut through the murmurs, drawing every eye in the room to her. There was a hush, the kind that precedes a storm. She took a deep breath and turned to face Mr. and Mrs. Hargrove directly. I have something important to share, about truth and pretense, she began, her gaze unwavering. I went to the same school as Charles and Eleanor Hargrove. Back then, they didn't carry an English accent or boast of noble blood. Their families were hard-working folks just like ours. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Charles's father was a mechanic, and Eleanor's mother served tables at the local diner. She paused, letting the words sink in. The portraits, the accents, the surname, they bought them. All to craft a past that would hide where they really came from. The room erupted into whispers, guests turning to stare at the Hargroves, their faces a mix of shock and disbelief. Mrs. Hargrove stood up, her face red, the facade of aristocracy melting away. That's preposterous. But my mom wasn't finished. To think that you would stand on these fabrications and look down upon my daughter, judge her worthiness based on a lie. Erica is worth 1,000 of your false titles. She is real, something you've long forgotten how to be. The guests were now openly murmuring, their looks of fascination turning to disdain as they gazed at the Hargroves. Mr. Hargrove tried to speak, his accent slipping into something less refined, more desperate. We did what we thought was best. For whom? My mom cut him off, her voice fierce. For your son? For society? Or just for your own shallow pride? The confrontation had drawn everyone's attention, and now the room was buzzing, the atmosphere charged with tension and revelations. The Hargroves seemed to shrink, their grandeur dissolving into the air, leaving nothing but the stark, plain truth of their origins. Jake's face twisted with a mix of shock and anger. He stormed up to me, his voice barely a hiss as he leaned close. You've ruined everything, Erica. You've disgraced my family, and now you're questioning if I want to marry you? After this spectacle? His words stung, but before I could respond, he grabbed my arm, pulling me slightly closer. I'll teach you how to be a good wife, one who knows her place and obeys. His threat hung in the air, heavy and chilling. I pulled my arm back with all my might, stepping away from him. The room was dead silent now, everyone's eyes on us. This was the man I had intended to marry? This was the family I was about to join? No, this couldn't be my life. I took a deep breath, my mother's earlier strength flowing through me. There will be no wedding, I announced loudly, making sure every guest heard. I regret that I ever considered marrying such a moron, someone who truly matches the arrogance and deceit of his parents. Murmurs filled the room, some of shock, others of support. Jake stood there, mouth agape, as if trying to catch the words and stuff them back into my mouth. My mother came to my side, her presence a comforting shield against the chaos. Together, we walked through the crowd, our heads held high. In the weeks that followed, news of the Hargroves' disgrace spread through the city. Their fabricated lineage and high society standing crumbled like a house of cards in a breeze. People who once revered them now crossed the street to avoid their shame. They sold their mansion and moved away, seeking a fresh start where their past wouldn't haunt them. As for Jake, I heard bits and pieces, rumors of a downward spiral, of nights spent at bars trying to drink away the scandal. I didn't know if they were true, and frankly, I didn't care to know. He had shown his true colors, and they were too dark and twisted for me ever to want to look back. "Thank you, Mom," I said to her one evening as we sat in our modest living room, a stark contrast to the opulent falsity I had almost married into. "For everything. For being there, for standing up for me, for helping me see the truth before it was too late." She took my hand, squeezing it gently. "I'll always be here, Erica. You're my daughter, and I raised you to be strong and true. No man, no family, can ever make you less than what you are." We sat there, the TV chattering in the background, a normalcy that felt refreshing. I had lost a fiancé, but gained back my life, my self-respect, and, more importantly, my future. After the whole wedding debacle, going back to work felt like walking into a sanctuary. My colleagues, who had heard about the chaos, were nothing short of supportive. "Erica, you dodged a bullet, girl," Marco said as soon as I walked into the office. He was leaning against my desk, a steaming cup of coffee in his hand, which he handed to me as a peace offering, or maybe a welcome-back gift. "Thanks, Marco. Feels good to be back," I replied, taking the coffee and savoring the familiar bitter warmth. "And yeah, that bullet was more like a cannonball." Jenny chimed in from her cubicle across the way. "Anyone who makes you serve guests at your own wedding is no husband material. You deserve way better, hun." I smiled, grateful for the camaraderie. "I think so too. It's nice to be back where I'm appreciated for what I do, not for the family I might have married into." As the days turned into weeks, the support from my team didn't waver. It was during this healing time that I met Brian. He was a friend of a friend, nothing fancy about his background, just a genuine guy with a quick smile and an easygoing attitude that was infectious. We met at a small get-together. It was low-key, just a few friends hanging out on a Saturday afternoon. He was there, laughing at something silly when I walked in. "Hey, you must be Erica," he said, standing up to greet me. "I've heard a lot about you." "All good things, I promise." "Thanks, Brian. I hope they didn't embellish too much," I replied, trying to match his easy demeanor. We hit it off instantly. His family was the polar opposite of the Hargroves. The first time I met his parents, they welcomed me with warm hugs and genuine smiles. "Erica, we're just glad Brian found someone who makes him so happy," his mom said, pulling me into a hug as soon as I stepped through their front door. It was refreshing, the simplicity of it all. No pretenses, no demands. Just mutual respect and acceptance. Brian and I weren't rushing anything. We were taking our time, getting to know each other beyond the surface level. Back at work, my boss called me into his office one day. Erica, I just want to say, we've all noticed how you've handled everything. It's not been easy, but you've managed to keep your performance top-notch. I nodded, unsure where this was leading. We think it's time for another promotion. You've proven you can handle just about anything, and your leadership has never wavered. Leaving his office, I felt a surge of pride. With a new relationship developing, a career on the rise, and the respect of those I cared about, I was finally in a place where I felt I belonged.